Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Recipe for Reality Small Bites. The last couple weeks I've taken off partly because there's just a lot of other stuff going on in the world between Halloween and the World Series and the election that I figured, you know what, let me take a few weeks off and kind of regroup, regather myself for this episode. And this was a fun one because I always try to theme our topics for these episodes off of the actual mainstay shows. And what has been proven in this recent kind of few episode arc of Survivor 47 is that we are seeing the emergence of underdogs. I mean, I love a Survivor underdog. I love watching someone kind of rise from the ashes, consistently kind of getting undermined by their peers and kind of rising above it. And we saw that recently, of course, with Andy, but I think throughout the season, just in general, just these different power shifts. And I think Jeff teased it when he was teasing Survivor 47 that this is the season of power shifts. But I wanted to look at kind of the grand scheme of Survivor and like who are the biggest underdogs in terms of like not just in their individual seasons, but in their representations as characters at large in the grand history of Survivor, and whose arcs do I think are the most engaging from that underdog perspective. And I'm going to tell you right now, there are probably 30-40 names that I left off the list that could very well be part of this list, because I feel like most seasons have an underdog, and I feel like even the seasons where, you know, the best player wins, I feel like they try to edit it in a certain way where they give the winner some adversity to overcome, to where it makes it hard to really call anyone an underdog, because I feel like everyone is at one point an underdog at some point in the season. There are very few wins that are dominant from beginning to end, and even some characters that don't win, I think there are some great just growth arcs in terms of their overall trajectory. So when I set out to make this topic, inspired by Andy's recent development as like this big underdog figure on Survivor 47, you know, I thought the list would be a lot more easy to pretty much delve out. And basically what happened at the end of this list was that I ended up with 9 winners and 1 non-winner on my list, because I think the most satisfying underdog stories are the ones that pay off in the end. But I did want to bring some honorable mentions up. Again, there is a 100% chance that I am going to omit some names that are definitely should be in consideration, that I'm sure you will let me know in the comments below that I missed. Again, I'm looking at their grand overall scheme of all their Survivor seasons. It's why someone like Stephanie LaGrossa, for example, someone who is the last person on Palau, she comes back in Guatemala and basically has control that entire season. So she is someone I didn't put on the list because I feel like, yes, she was an underdog on her first season, but looking at her overall Survivor journey, I think she kind of showed that she could be the underdog and then kind of come back and have a strong return. Same as someone like Cochran, who is very much an underdog in the grand scheme of life. You know, he's this scrawny guy, underestimated, but his second season is so dominant that I didn't want to consider him one of Survivor's top 10 underdogs, just because I feel like that second season is so dominant. But let me take you through some honorable mentions. Starting, I do have the entire cast of Gabon, because I was thinking about who the underdog is. Is it Bob? Not really. Is it Sugar? Kind of, but not really, because she's in control for a lot of it. Is it Kenny? Is it Crystal? Who is the real underdog of Gabon? And I think that's the reason I omitted all of them from the list. I considered Eric Reichenbach, obviously this fan amongst all the favorites, kind of getting his comeuppance by the women. But the truth of the matter is, you know, he did have solid grounding at one point in the game. There's a reason he's the last fan left. I mean, he was an underdog amongst the other favorites, but amongst the fans, I don't think he's as much of an underdog as someone like Tracy, as someone like Jason Siska on that season, that they were underdogs on their own tribe. Same as Chet, Kathy. So I feel like he's a top dog on his tribe, but an underdog when you pair him with the 4 women who undermined him at the end of the game. I considered Spencer Bledsoe, now known as Raymond Bledsoe. Obviously, Spencer, kind of in the beginning of his seasons, always struggled to find his footing, but I feel like at the end, both times, he kind of proved that he could find footing, especially in Cambodia. He had a pretty solid majority for most of that post-merge with Jeremy and with Tasha, so I didn't really consider him for this list. Some recent examples, I considered Caleb and Emily from 45, obviously being Lulu's, kind of overcoming that, but Caleb gets sniped out so fast, and I think quickly Emily just kind of fades into not necessarily being the underdog, but just kind of being one of the top dogs. It's a very cool arc, but it wasn't quite enough to crack into this list. And then Jake from 45 as well, just kind of hit or miss. He's very much the Charlie Brown, where he keeps taking so many swings, keeps missing, can't quite find his footing, which makes him an endearing underdog. But I think because his arc isn't necessarily paid off, I couldn't give him a spot on this top 10. Same as like Romeo from Survivor 42. Some winners, actually, that I considered that I didn't put on the list. Danny Boatwright from Guatemala. An underdog, I guess, probably just because of her edit. You know, she's kind of a quieter player. I don't necessarily consider her a big underdog, though I could see an argument where her edit made her an underdog. Same as like Sophie Clark. I think Sophie was in a lot more power than people were led to believe, but I think because she gets that comeuppance on Coach, you could view her as an underdog, though I think there's another winner on my top 10 that kind of fits that mold a little bit better. Another winner, a very recent winner, Erica. Again, I think it's circumstantial due to the edit that she was an underdog, but kind of throughout the season, we've heard a lot of people say, Erica's the top dog, Erica's the one to beat, we need to throw the challenge to get her out. And to me, that doesn't really scream underdog as much as it is an edit underdog. And then we have 43, where I think all the final three are considered underdogs to some extent. Cassidy kind of being this underestimated female, kind of overcoming and kind of making her way to the end by winning that immunity. Owen obviously kind of fits the whole Jake thing of like, he's the Charlie Brown who keeps swinging and missing, can't really get anything to go right for him, but he is an endearing person that we root for. And then Gabler, who is kind of one of the ultimate underdogs, but I don't think it's as satisfying because we're not necessarily rooting for Gabler. I guess there are some people who were, but I think because he doesn't have that rooting interest that someone like Owen or Cassidy has, or even Jesse, who Jesse's a top dog. He's not an underdog, but just in nature, they are more scrappy players. Gabler isn't the rootable underdog, but he is an underdog nonetheless. And then another recent example that I wanted to bring up, even though I'm probably the only person in the world who would put her on the list, is Venus from the most recent season, Survivor 46. I've always rooted for Venus. I thought she was unfairly treated out there. I thought she was an outcast. But again, it's hard to see certain perspectives because the edit plays a lot into that, and we've heard very, very numerous responses from every player you ask has a different opinion on the Venus situations at camp. So is she an underdog? Was she edited as an underdog? Either way, I rooted for her. I wanted her to make a deeper run in the competition, and she did. But then she did find an idol, and that was kind of her undoing. So can you really call someone an underdog who has an idol in their pocket and fails to play it? If she had played that idol and negated those votes and made it to the end, like, she is definitely in contention, but ultimately didn't make the list, but I had to shout out Venus here. But now we get to our top 10, and again, like I said, all 10 of the slots except for one are all winners, because again, an underdog story is most satisfying when the winners win out in the end. But at number 10, I kind of made a cheat, and I kind of put all of the Davids from David vs. Goliath. Now, obviously, this season was all about the underdogs. It was all about this kind of scrappy, scrawny, weaker player or person who is a little bit more of a fighter in life going up against the Goliaths, the people who were a little bit more privileged, had a little bit more given to them, the doctors, the lawyers, the athletes, if you will. So it was a very, circumstantial thing, because obviously we as audience members are going to naturally root for the Davids. Now, I didn't want to single out Nick in particular because I don't really like Nick as a person. If you know, you know. So I didn't want to necessarily single him out, but I think all of the Davids to some extent, Gabby and Christian and Davey of the Davids, I think they're all very rootable underdog figures, and I really do think it was a team effort. I think all of them kind of came together to kind of defy the Goliaths, and yes, the Goliaths had the majority at the end. You had people like Mike and Allison and Kara and Angelina and Alec all in the end game, but I think it's really impressive watching the few that really do overcome, even like Carl playing the idol nullifier, Davey playing his idol on Christian, and then Nick kind of having this underdog run at the end with immunities. It is a very rootable interest of a team, and I think of any tribe on Survivor's history, the Davids are the ultimate underdog tribe. So I wanted to give them overall this number 10 slot. Now, at number 9 is the person who did not win the game, though I think of any underdog that didn't win the game, she has the fullest arc, and I guess you could say to an extent her whole alliance is an underdog alliance, but it is going to be Carolyn from Survivor 44. I almost said 45. I can't get these numbers straight in my head because they don't give them subtitles anymore, so you kind of have to just rely on remembering what number a season is which. But yeah, Carolyn, the ultimate underdog, even amidst that underdog alliance of, Jam Jam, Carson, and Carolyn. I think Carolyn was always going to be the underdog, even amongst them. And I think that's why I didn't put the Tika 3 as a unit here, because I think Carson is very clearly inept for the game, very strategic thinker, had a lot of power. Jam Jam as well had so much social power. But Carolyn, I feel like the audience and the people on the island didn't necessarily take her seriously, and then when we began to take her seriously, the people on the island still didn't. And I think that's the difference between like Jam Jam, Carson, and Carolyn, is that I feel like people understood that Jam Jam and Carson were threats and that they eventually had to get them out, but there were just other people in the way. Jam Jam and Carson were good enough players to get out of that, and they did have Carolyn in their back pocket, but I don't think anyone really treated Carolyn with the respect she was deserved, because Carolyn was making moves, she was being innovative. The birdcage idol moment comes to mind, just the way she was strategically thinking about the game in a much more level-headed place than one would care to admit, based on her zany personality. But she was the ultimate underdog of that season, and that whole season is kind of focused around that Tika 3 kind of overcoming the odds, I should say, as those underdogs. And I think Carolyn is a big part of that. So I wanted to put Carolyn in this 9 spot, even though the 8 players above her obviously did get the job done at the end of the day as winners. So at number 8 is another winner that I feel like, a lot of his underdog nature is due to circumstance, but he is an underdog nonetheless, and that is Mike Holloway. Now, Mike Holloway, I think the gift he is given is that his cast is so unlikable. You have people like Dan, you have people like Rodney, like Will, even some people don't like Shireen, all these people that, even now in retrospect, Joe and Sierra, a lot of people that now, if you rewatch season 30, you root for Mike because the cast around him is so unlikable. But what helps is the fact that he has to win out. He has to win these challenges. He has to find these idols. He has to play the way he plays in the auction to keep himself alive in the game. And I think that's something that we don't see in a lot of players. Even the underdogs that are higher on his list, a lot of those underdogs didn't have to win out. They found their way to the end. Mike had to, and I think that's a really interesting kind of character journey, a character arc that no one else has really accomplished. I mean, you could look at Ben as a similar example. The only thing is, like, Ben wasn't as much of a rootable interest because his cast was more likable. I think a lot of people were rooting for Devin or Dr. Mike or Ryan or Chrissy. Here, not only was Mike scrapping to the end by winning challenges and finding idols, but people actually rooted for him to do it. People wanted to see him overcome the villains of his season and win out. Even though Mike is not necessarily the most likable player, he was the most likable player on that season. Now, obviously, I have a soft spot for Mama C, so I still wanted Mama C to win, which is, again, why Mike is lower on the list. But I think if you just look at underdog arcs, no one else has been able to win out to the end and successfully clinch that victory. Ozzy couldn't do it. Brad Culpepper couldn't do it. So the fact that Mike does it, I give him a pat on the back too, because that is the ultimate underdog journey of knowing you're going home but winning a challenge or finding an idol and saving yourself and scrapping to the end by your own volition, your own stamina, your own power, which I think is really fascinating. But at number 7, a bit of a similar circumstance, though I think he's even more of an underdog just based on the season's themes in general, and that is Chris Underwood. I think just the idea of getting voted out, coming back into the game and winning your way to the end, playing idols, putting yourself in fire against Rick Devens. I think he has a similar arc to Mike, but I think Mike, the thing is, he had a little bit more power early on in the game, whereas Chris had no power early on in the game because he was on the edge of extinction. I think it's a really, really cool story. Now, do I want to see this replicated in every season? No, but also because I'm not the biggest Rick Devens fan, I thought this was a really fun kind of power through in the finale. But then again, as a huge Victoria fan and a huge Lauren fan, I think there were other players who were robbed at the expense of Chris Underwood, but just on paper, it is a very fascinating underdog story. The fact that you can get voted out of the game, come back and win, is just something we had never seen before. Matt Elrod couldn't do it on Redemption Island. Andrea couldn't do it on Redemption Island. Christine couldn't do it on South Pacific. Neither could Ozzy. So I do think, it's very admirable to see someone actually take advantage of that and make it to the end and scrap their way to the end in a way that Chris Underwood did. Moving on to number 6, just outside of the top 5, I put someone who I think could be considered an underdog by their edit, more so than their actual placement in the game. I think their alliance was certainly an underdog alliance, but I think she herself was a lot more secure in the game, not as much as of an underdog until the very final tribal, but nonetheless, I had to put her on the list, and that is Natalie White. Obviously, one of the biggest underdog victories in terms of beating Russell in the end, and I think that's why she ends up so high on this list, is that you took a player who did so much less in terms of big flashy moves compared to her counterpart, but it turns out that playing just this clean social game ended up being the thing that clinched her the victory. It's a really cool win, especially if we had seen the full edit, and I think the reason is, they wanted to keep it more of a surprise. They wanted to kind of show how Russell lost more so than how Natalie won, but I do think that aids in her underdog nature as well, the fact that we didn't get to see her full game and that she didn't appear as a top dog. Now, if you look at this alliance in general, Russell, Jason, Mick, Natalie is the most underestimated, but I do think she was the most secure because I always thought that those bigger players were always going to be targeted first, and I think Natalie got to squeeze by, which, doesn't make her as much of an underdog, but I think the FOA 4 in general is such an underdog alliance. The fact that they went into the merge with only 4 people and became 4 of the final 5, I think that's really impressive in and of itself, and I think Natalie being the one to kind of emerge as the victor of that deserves her kudos and her congratulations and her spotlight here. But at number 5, kicking off the top 5, we have someone who kind of fit the same trajectory as Stephanie LaGrossa, but ended up making it all the way to the end, and that is Denise Staples from Survivor Philippines, and of course, Winners at War. Now, this is the first two-time player we're getting to talk about here on this list, so I kind of put her lower on this list because of her Winners at War appearance, but even her Winners at War appearance, she does still become the underdog at times in that game. I think by the end she kind of fizzles out. She's not as much of an underdog. She's in a little bit more control, but especially that moment where she takes out Sandra with her own idol, that is an underdog move. Now, was it a smart move? I would argue no, because Sandra is not a threat to beaten challenges at the end. I think if anything, she should have taken out Jeremy or Tony with that move, but regardless, I mean, Denise's first season is the reason why she is on this list to begin with. The fact that she went to every single tribal council and survived every single tribal council, that is an underdog story. Yes, she had power at times, and I think that's why she's not in the top 4, is because on her own tribe, she and Malcolm were the driving strategic factors, but then once you hit the merge, it's very easy to pick off the two outsiders. I mean, we saw it with Caleb and Emily. Emily made it further in the game in 45, but Caleb got picked off right away. So I think, it is very easy to just pick off the people in the minority, but the fact that Denise was able to survive time after time after time, I think her and Malcolm were both very savvy, very fun, very rootable underdogs, but the fact that she was able to even overcome Malcolm, who was very clearly the stronger player, probably the more strategic player, the fact that she was able to even outlast him is in and of itself a smaller underdog story in a grander underdog story arc. So I think Denise is definitely an underdog. On Winners of War, not as much of an underdog, but she still has her underdog moments, especially with getting out Sandra as this Queen Slayer, so I did put her here at number 5. Number 4, the only new era player aside from Carolyn to make it onto this list, and it is the winner of Survivor 42, it is Maryanne. Now, Maryanne, an example of someone who was very fortunate based on the tribe draw she was given Jonathan. They weren't ever going to lose a challenge. The only person they lost in the pre-merge was Jackson due to a medical thing, not even due to any sort of vote. So I did think this was a very interesting trajectory for Maryanne, because if they lose a challenge in the pre-merge, Maryanne's the boot. It's not going to be Omer. It's not going to be Lindsay. It's not going to be Jonathan. I mean, they're getting rid of Maryanne the first chance they have in that pre-merge. So I thought this was a very cool just kind of underdog story for her as someone who was on the bottom of her alliance, and then when she hits the merge, she kind of fades into the middle a little bit. She has that great moment with Drea where they both play their idols to stand up against black people getting sent home back to back to back. Again, kind of a social underdog story in that way, where she's just a rootable interest because she's overcoming societal odds. And then of course at the end, when she takes out Omer, and Omer said, "Who did that? Did you do that?" and she owns that move. And then at the very, very end, pulling out the idol that she didn't even need to play. I think Maryanne is one of the better underdog winners we've seen, because from the top, it should be obvious that she's very lovable, very social, but we are told from the very beginning that she is the outcast on her tribe, which makes us even more endeared toward her to win. But because of the new era, and because she is ultimately the winner, she's still such a focal point that we feel like we see Maryanne's game through and through. But it is an underdog game through and through, which makes it even more exciting to watch from a viewer perspective. It's one of the great wins of the new era because we saw it coming based on the edit, but it's still an underdog story nonetheless. Now, kicking off the top 3, this was like my definitive top 3. This was the 3 that, as soon as I thought of this list, I wanted to put these guys at the top 3 spots. I just struggle with the order, and I think the reason I'm putting this person at number 3 as opposed to 2 or 1 is because he is massively helped by a big bombshell in the middle of the merge portion of the game, to where if this doesn't happen, if this double quit doesn't happen, this guy's toast and doesn't even have the opportunity to have this huge underdog story. But it is Fabio from Nicaragua. Now, here's the thing. I think that season is underrated, and I think the reason it's underrated is because Fabio is just such a likable guy and a likable winner. It kind of goes to the Mike Holloway thing of, like, he was playing with people you just really didn't love. I mean, no one's really, like, losing their mind over Benry or Jane. Jane won America's Favorite that year, and I don't think anyone still talks about how much they love Jane. Obviously, I already said Benry, Sash and Chase, not the most likable people on that season. So I think, he was helped by the fact that he was the most likable guy left with, like, 9 people left in the game. I mean, the only other person I think was rivaling him at that point was Holly, and even Holly, a lot of people were annoyed based on, how she started the game as someone who wanted to quit and then overcame it, which again could be an underdog story for Holly in and of herself. But I think Fabio, the thing is, he's just such a nice guy that you want to root for him nonetheless, but the fact that he's a nice guy and he's the biggest target and he has no shot of winning at the early merge portion of the game makes his underdog story so much more fun, because once that double quit happens, it's like, whoa, Fabio now has like a 1 in 6 shot of winning the game, and then, wait, Fabio wins immunity or two. Now he's like a 1 in 4 shot of winning the game. And what? Oh, he's in the final tribal. Oh, shoot. Fabio's going to win this game. And I think that's one of the more fun underdog stories is that, early merge, you're like, all right, Fabio's toast if he loses another immunity or two. But because of that double quit, it kind of gives him a second life in the game. And he's able to kind of use all of that momentum to take him to the end. So it's similar to like Mike Holloway in the fact that, yes, Fabio does have to win out, but he has to win out after having basically no shot because, let's be honest, he wasn't going to win 6 or 7 immunities. So it's really just like, he was already having to overcome being on the outs, and then he kind of gets that glimmer of hope, and then he is able to win out because he has that glimmer of hope. It's a really fun underdog story that we will never really see replicated unless we get another big like double quit or double medevac, which I really hope doesn't happen because obviously it sours a lot of this people's opinion on the season at large. But because of that double quit, we get this really, really cool endgame story from Fabio that we wouldn't have gotten, because if Nyanka and Kelly stay in the game, Fabio goes out in like 7th or 8th place, and we probably never hear his name again because they probably under-edit him as well. But because, he's given that extra like boost of 2 rounds, that's basically 2 free passes. Now all you have to do is win a few immunities. And I think that's what makes it even more exciting than someone like Mike's victory, where Mike had to win out, but Mike had to win out due to kind of his own doing. Fabio was just a likable dude that people wanted out. He just wasn't in the numbers, and he's given this chance to kind of win back some favor, especially with a jury. I don't know. I love Fabio's arc. I think he's a forgotten about winner at this point. I would love to see him come back again. I don't think it'll happen ever, but man, if Fabio ends up on Survivor 50's cast, like, it would be one of the biggest shocks, but like one of the most exciting announcements I could have, ever seen coming. I couldn't see it coming because he's such a great character. But my top 2, here we go. At number 2, someone who is not just an underdog on their first season, but an underdog on their second season as well, which is why I had to catapult him up here to number 2, and that is Adam Klein. Now, Adam is very interesting because Adam on paper is someone who probably shouldn't be an underdog. He's very savvy. He knows the game inside and out. He's very good at making these social bonds. He's a likable guy. He's a funny guy. He's a charismatic guy. He knows the game through and through. He finds idols. He finds advantages, at least ones that he thinks are idols and advantages. Can I play that? Can I play that podium, Jeff? But the thing with Adam is that he just gets so unlucky. He just aligns with the wrong people. Very early on in Millennials vs. Gen X, he's on the opposite of the Mari boot, and then he tries to find his way back in, but then he ends up on the outside when the Figgy and Taylor thing happens, and then he's like in that whole kind of mess and catastrophe with the food. Now, the thing about Millennials vs. Gen X that is so interesting is that, you go into the season and you kind of go into the first few episodes thinking David is going to be the ultimate underdog, but very quickly, David becomes the big power player. So it's almost like Adam becomes the underdog to the underdog, where you thought it was going to be David, then it becomes Adam, and then essentially Jay also becomes a bit of his own underdog in a way too at the end. And I think it's a very fascinating kind of final dynamic where the 3 big threats to win the game at the end are Jay, David, and Adam. But Adam is the underdog of those guys because Jay has the challenge strength, David has the strategic strength, Adam just kind of has to rely on his social bonds and his convincing of Hannah and Ken to make everything he wants to happen. Having Ken flip on David, I mean, that is also partially Hannah's doing. I think there's a lot of underdogs in Millennials vs. Gen X. Zeke is another one, Hannah is another one, Ken himself is another one. But I think Adam, because he's able to kind of overcome that and win in the end, despite being on the outs of those votes early on in the game, it's really impressive to see, especially because I do feel like I see a lot of myself in Adam in terms of the way I would play the game if I were out there. So just to see him kind of have that adversity and instead of like crumbling under it, get back to work and try to make it happen and scrap his way to the end. It's a very messy game, but it's a very engaging one. It's a very admirable one. But I think what really earns him that big underdog status is in his Winners at War game, where he is just kind of one of those random 30s winners that, like, yeah, it's fun to see Adam back, but, like, he makes the most of that experience. He's playing against people like Parvati, like Boston Rob, Kim Spradlin. He's playing against the greatest of the greats, and the way he's able to kind of essentially kind of one-up all these really massive players in the game, Boston Rob specifically, is really, really fascinating. Obviously, he's not the direct undoing of Boston Rob, but he is part of it, and it does show that he is a scrappy fighter of a player, and it's just always fun to see what Adam brings. Adam is a very entertaining player, but I think it's because he's always playing from the bottom, and I don't ever remember a circumstance where Adam was in complete control, except for maybe a few glimpses here and there of Millennials vs. Gen X, but even then, like, he's willing to go to rocks. He is a scrappy player that I feel like if you're talking about power shifts and talking about someone always ending up on the wrong side of power, it is Adam, but somehow, some way, he's able to overcome it. And then we talk about the personal underdog nature of it too. The fact that he's playing for his mom who has cancer, and the fact that his mom dies as soon as he gets home. That in and of itself is also aiding in Adam's overall story, his overall underdog arc, that makes you just want to root for him more, because his life has made him an underdog, and the fact that he has to play for something that emotionally, devastates him day in and day out. The fact that he can't even speak about it on the island because he doesn't want to be pegged as this big, sympathy vote threat. And I think that's another thing that he has to overcome as an underdog, is the fact that he has to reckon with this emotional turmoil every day, and he doesn't have anyone to share that with until the very end when he shares it with Jay. So I think all of those elements and more make Adam an essential underdog in Survivor for not one but 2 seasons. But number one had to be my number one, the ultimate underdog story, my favorite underdog story, which really sucks because, I'm usually, the pro women's alliance. I'm always rooting for the ladies on the Game of Survivor, but there's just one exception, and it is Chris Dougherty just completely finding his way somehow, some way to the end of Survivor Vanuatu. This is the most miraculous underdog story because it is the easiest person to pick off. Because Chris isn't winning a lot of challenges either, so it's all these women and Chris, and all they have to do is just vote him out. Yet they completely turn in on themselves. They completely bicker with one another. They start taking each one another out, to where Chris just skates by somehow, some way. And a lot of it is his own doing, yes, but a lot of it is just the women realizing that they are bigger threats to one another than Chris is to them. But by the point they realize Chris is a big enough threat, it's too late. And the way that Chris is able to BS his way at the end, it is just one of the most fascinating Survivor underdog stories for me. And like I said, I always root for the women alliances. I always tend to prefer rooting for women over men in the Game of Survivor, because I think women in general in society are our underdogs that, should rise above. And I always love to see rise above. I don't know if it's just the recent election results talking that makes me feel so empowered to say that. But I always root for the women to kind of get the comeuppance on the men on Survivor. But this is one very rare instance where just seeing Chris survive week after week after week without even having to win every single challenge, just by, making sure those holes are made in that women's alliance and finding those holes and putting cracks in that alliance, is masterful to me. I can't believe it that it even exists, that it even happened. And the fact that Chris hasn't come back, obviously there's a lot of personal stuff with Julie Berry and Jeff Probst, and, I don't think Jeff wants Chris back in the game, but I would love to see what happens if you put Chris on a season where he's not playing in a men versus women template, if he's able to kind of, make a similar run, or if he fizzles out early. But I think because of the nature of the season, men versus women, and the men just getting picked off one after another, and him being the last man standing with all these women and somehow making it to the end, it is just so miraculous to me. Like, I really can't believe it happened. I can't believe he made it happen. I can't believe the others allowed it to happen. But I think just the bullshitting at the end is kind of the cherry on top, because he is a player who admittedly does a lot of impressive things to get to the end, but in the end, he kind of has to sell a lot of fibs and kind of dramatize it and fabricate it to get himself that win, which is also kind of that underdog mentality of like, you know what? I'm going to do whatever it takes to win. I'm going to be scrappy. I'm going to fight my way to the end. I'm going to kind of continue to butter up this jury. And that in and of itself is another underdog thing that even Adam doesn't have. Adam, his game speaks for himself, where he had all those votes going into that final tribal, despite being the underdog most of the season. He is not the underdog at final tribal. Chris is still the underdog at the end, because Twyla did more visible stuff that season. Twyla had a few more allies, but I think Twyla burned a lot more allies, and Chris was able to repair it, or at least bullshit enough in the final tribal to make it seem like he was repairing it. I just think Chris's game is fascinating. I think it's one of the most fascinating underdog stories I've ever seen, and for me it ranks here at number one for the greatest Survivor underdog in the history of its 46 and a half seasons. But who's to say we won't see Caroline or Andy or Sue or one of these players, Genevieve, Rachel, become the number one when this season is said and done. But that is my list here for the top 10 Survivor underdogs. Thank you for watching this list, and stay tuned for more Recipe for Reality Small Bites. Thanks a lot.